Every neurologist at Jackson Memorial had given up. The most feared mafia boss in South Florida, a man who'd controlled Miami's criminal underworld with calculated brutality since his early 20s, was lying in ICU room 2319, surrounded by machines that measured the distance between life and nothing. 4 weeks after a rival family's botched hit left Jeffrey Fernandez with catastrophic brain damage and multi-organ failure, Dr. Ramos stood at the foot of his bed and told his brother Mateo what everyone already knew. There was no brain activity beyond basic stem reflexes. His kidneys were shutting down, and they had 96 hours before the decision would be made for them. The criminal empire was already being dismantled like a carcass. The Castellanos were moving cocaine through Jeffrey's old ports. Marco Vega, his supposed right hand, had rerouted 3 shipments before Jeffrey's heart monitor even stabilized. Federal agents positioned outside like vultures, ready to sweep in the moment the machines went silent. Not a single visitor to room 2319 came with prayers or grief. Only lawyers with dissolution papers, lieutenants testing the waters of betrayal, and enemies offering condolences that tasted like victory. But every night at 11 p.m., a woman with calloused hands and a rosary in her pocket would push her cleaning cart through that door and do something no one else did. She'd talk to him. Not because she knew Jeffrey Fernandez had 47 kills attributed to his name, not because she wanted protection or money or favors, but because Elena Lopez, a 29-year-old undocumented immigrant from Honduras, had been taught by her abuela that no soul should cross over alone, no matter what sins weighted it down. Elena was drowning in her own survival, a single mother working the graveyard shift at the hospital and weekend doubles at a laundromat in Little Havana, raising a 3-year-old on $11 an hour, carrying the scar of a C-section she still owed $18,000 for, one ICE checkpoint away from losing everything. She had every reason to keep invisible, to clean in silence, to never look too long at the tattooed man whose neck bore the Virgin Mary and whose knuckles spelled out something in Portuguese she didn't want to translate. But instead, she told this dying stranger about Christina's laugh that sounded like wind chimes, about the way her daughter counted stars through their apartment window, even though they could only see 3 through the glow of the streetlights, about the little yellow shoes they'd found at Goodwill that made Christina run faster, as if happiness could be tied with laces. And somewhere in the gray, endless fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in Miami was holding on to that voice like a man buried alive, clawing toward light. Because Elena's stories about Christina were the only thing tethering Jeffrey's mind to the world, the only warmth in the freezing void where his consciousness floated, half dissolved. Then came the night that shattered everything, when Christina's fever spiked to 104 degrees and Elena had no babysitter, no money for an ER visit, no choice but to smuggle her burning, whimpering daughter into the hospital, wrapped in her work jacket. And in a moment of pure desperation and exhaustion, after 3 hours of Christina crying, after Elena had cleaned 4 rooms with a sick toddler clinging to her neck, she did the unthinkable. She laid little Christina, delirious and dressed in her red cotton dress, on the broad chest of a man the whole world had already declared dead. What happened over the next 6 hours wasn't neuroscience, it wasn't medicine, and not a single doctor at Jackson Memorial could explain why a child's tiny hands gripping a hospital gown, why the weight of a 3-year-old's feverish body, why the soft, desperate breathing against still ribs would trigger what millions of dollars in medical intervention could not. If this story doesn't prove that some miracles have nothing to do with God and everything to do with the inexplicable physics of human connection, nothing will. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who's killed 47 men. It's the one who refuses to let a stranger die alone. And sometimes resurrection doesn't come from heaven. It comes from a toddler in a red dress who wouldn't let the devil slip away. Marco Vega stood outside room 2319, his shoulder against the pale green wall of the ICU corridor, his eyes fixed on the dried blood still crusted beneath his fingernails, Jeffrey's blood, that he hadn't scrubbed away since that night. It had been 4 weeks, and he could still smell the gunpowder mixed with salt air from the marina, still hear the crack of Jeffrey's skull hitting the concrete pier, still see the moment his boss's eyes rolled back, mouth opening in a silent gasp as blood spread beneath him like a dark halo under the dock lights. Marco had put bullets in both shooters before they'd made it to their car, one through the temple, one through the throat. Clean kills, the way Jeffrey had taught him. But when he dropped to his knees in Jeffrey's blood, pressing both hands against the wound in his boss's side, trying to hold the pieces together until the paramedics arrived, he'd known this was different. This wasn't a hit they'd walk away with stitches and a story. From that night on, Marco hadn't left Jackson Memorial, not once. He'd known Jeffrey Fernandez since they were both 14-year-old runners in Alapata, back when Jeffrey was just a kid with dead eyes and quick hands who'd figured out that fear was more valuable than loyalty.
Elena Lopez had learned to move like a ghost through Jackson Memorial's ICU, quietly, efficiently, invisible in the way that cleaning staff always were to doctors and families who looked through her like she was part of the walls. But room 2319 was different. Room 2319 had become her confessional, and the tattooed man connected to machines that beeped his slow countdown to death had become the only person she could tell the truth to. "Buenas noches, señor," she whispered in Spanish, pushing her cart through the door at 11:07 p.m., same as always. The armed guard outside didn't even glance at her anymore. 3 weeks of the same routine had made her part of the furniture. She pulled on latex gloves and began wiping down the IV stand, her voice soft against the mechanical breathing of the ventilator. "Cristina said a new word today, Luna. She pointed at the moon through our window and said it so clear, like she'd been saving it up just for me." She smiled at the memory, even as her hands moved methodically, disinfecting the bed rails, checking the corners for dust the day shift always missed. "Your nurse, Patricia, she has a daughter too, did you know that? She showed me pictures. Her daughter goes to a real preschool with painted walls and books. Cristina, she learns from the TV when I can keep the electricity on." Elena's voice caught slightly. She moved to wipe the monitor screens, watching the green lines spike and fall, spike and fall. "The rent is due Friday. I'm short $340. I keep thinking maybe I can ask for extra hours, but I'm already working 6 days, and who would watch Cristina?" Her laugh was bitter and small. "Miguel Santos came by again yesterday. You know Miguel? No, of course you don't. He says my husband owed his people money before he died. Says now I owe it. Says he can make problems go away if I'm nice to him." She wrung out her cloth in the bucket, the water turning gray. "I saw the way he looked at Cristina, like she was something he could use against me." Elena's hand trembled as she wiped down the windowsill, her back to the bed. "I'm scared, señor. I'm scared of the shadows that follow me home from the bus stop, scared of the letter from immigration that came last week, scared that one morning I'll wake up and Cristina will be gone, taken by ICE or Miguel, or just by this city that eats people like me." She turned back to face him, this man with the Virgin Mary tattooed on his neck and scars that mapped a violent life across his knuckles and forearms. "My abuela used to say that God listens to prayers spoken to the dying because they're already standing at heaven's door. So I'm praying through you, señor. I'm praying someone hears me before the shadows catch up." Elena touched his hand briefly, just once, her fingertips against his scarred knuckles, before she picked up her cart and disappeared back into the fluorescent hallway, leaving only the faint scent of industrial cleaner and the echo of her whispered confessions in the sterile air. Marco Vega watched Miami's criminal underworld devour Jeffrey's empire from a plastic chair outside room 2319, his phone lighting up with messages that read like obituaries for an organization built on fear and blood money. The Castellanos had moved shipments through the port of Miami twice in the last week. Jeffrey's port, Jeffrey's routes, using Jeffrey's bought and paid for customs officials like they'd always owned them. Marco had received a text an hour ago with just 2 words, "Our condolences." He wanted to put bullets in every single one of them, but Jeffrey had taught him that rage without strategy was just suicide with extra steps. "Vega?" The voice belonged to Tommy Restrepo, one of Jeffrey's enforcers who'd already started taking calls from the Castellanos. Marco didn't look up from his phone. "You still playing nurse? Boss is already gone, man. Dr. Ramos is pulling the plug Sunday morning. Mateo signed the papers." Marco's jaw tightened. "Get the fuck out of here, Tommy." "I'm just saying, there's opportunities. People are asking where your loyalty's gonna land when—" Marco was on his feet so fast, Tommy stumbled backward. "When what? When he's dead? You're already counting his money?" He stepped closer, voice dropping to something cold and final. "You take one meeting with the Castellanos, you make one move on his territory, and I'll gut you in the street like the traitor you are. Now get out of my sight before I forget Jeffrey taught me patience." Tommy left, but Marco knew he wouldn't be the last. Across the hospital, in a gray sedan parked in the visitor lot, Sarah Chen sat with a folder thick enough to put Jeffrey Fernandez away for 3 consecutive life sentences. Racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder. Evidence gathered over 18 months of wiretaps and turned witnesses and financial forensics. She'd been waiting for Jeffrey to wake up so she could read him his rights personally, watch his face when he realized the empire was over, even if he survived. But Jeffrey wasn't waking up, and corpses couldn't be indicted. Chen tapped her pen against the folder, watching the ICU entrance. She'd give it until Sunday. After that, she'd pivot to Marco Vega and the others, watch them tear each other apart for the scraps, and build cases from the chaos. Either way, the Fernandez organization was finished. Inside room 2319, Dr. Ramos stood at the foot of Jeffrey's bed with Mateo Fernandez, Jeffrey's older brother who'd gone legitimate years ago, owned car dealerships, paid taxes, pretended the family money came from honest work. Mateo's signature on the papers authorizing withdrawal of life support was steady, practiced. He'd already mourned his brother years ago when Jeffrey chose blood over redemption. Sunday morning, 6 a.m. We'll remove the ventilator, discontinue pressers. He won't feel anything. It'll be peaceful. Mateo nodded, looking at his brother's still face. He never did anything peaceful in his life. But yeah, Sunday. Outside, Marco heard it all through the partially open door. 72 hours. That's all Jeffrey had left. 72 hours before the wolves finished their feast and the king of Miami became just another body in the ground.
Elena Lopez had crossed the border in the back of a refrigerated truck with 17 other people, pressed so close she could feel every heartbeat around her like they were one desperate organism trying to survive. That was 4 years ago, when she was 25 and stupid enough to believe America meant safety. Her husband Carlos had already been in Miami for 6 months, working construction, sending money home to Honduras, promising he'd get papers, promising everything would be different. For 8 months it was. They had a tiny apartment in Little Havana that smelled like other people's cooking and had bars on the windows, but it was theirs. Carlos worked 12-hour days and came home smelling like cement dust and sweat, and Elena cleaned houses for cash under the table, and they were building something. They were going to make it. Then she got pregnant, and Carlos picked up a second job doing night security for a warehouse in Alapata. Elena told him it felt wrong, that the men who hired him had dead eyes and guns in their waistbands, but they needed money for the baby. They needed everything.
Cristina came 2 months early on a March night when Elena's water broke at 32 weeks, and Carlos wasn't answering his phone because he was already dead, caught in crossfire between two gangs fighting over territory that had nothing to do with him. He just happened to be standing in the wrong warehouse at the wrong time, and the bullet that went through his throat didn't care that he had a wife hemorrhaging in a county hospital bed 3 miles away. Elena woke up to a NICU incubator holding a 3-pound infant who looked like a baby bird, fragile and impossible, and $47,000 in medical bills she had no way to pay. The hospital social worker spoke to her in slow, loud English, like Elena was stupid instead of just terrified, explaining payment plans and charity care and how lucky she was that Cristina was alive. They reduced the debt to $18,000. Elena signed papers she barely understood and took her daughter home 2 months later to an empty apartment that still smelled like Carlos. Miguel Santos appeared 6 months after that, knocking on her door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a lie about Carlos owing money to people who didn't forget debts just because someone died. $2,000, he said. Small, really. Carlos would have wanted her to handle it. When Elena said she didn't have it, Miguel's smile stayed fixed. That's okay, Mommy. We can work something out. You're pretty. You work hard. I'm sure we can find an arrangement. He came back every month. The number never went down. His hand stayed on her doorframe a little too long. His eyes traveled over her body like she was merchandise. Last week, he'd crouched down to Cristina's level, touched her hair, and said, "Beautiful little girl. Would be a shame if something happened to her mama and she ended up alone." Elena started carrying a knife in her purse. She took different routes home. She became invisible, a ghost who cleaned hospitals at night and prayed Miguel Santos would forget she existed. But men like Miguel never forgot. They just waited.
Elena was emptying the trash bin outside the ICU nurses' station when she heard Patricia's voice, tired and matter-of-fact, talking to the night shift supervisor. Fernandez in 2319. Family signed the DNR. Sunday morning at 6, Dr. Ramos is pulling the plug. Poor bastard's been hanging on for a month, but there's nothing left in there. The supervisor made a sympathetic noise. The brothers seem okay with it? Mateo? Yeah, he's been ready for weeks. Honestly, I think he mourned Jeffrey years ago when he went full-on criminal. This is just paperwork now. Patricia sighed, the sound of someone who'd seen too many deaths to let them cut deep anymore. We'll prep the room Saturday night, make it quick and clean. Marco Vega's been camping outside. He's gonna take it hard. Elena's hand stilled on the trash bag. Sunday morning. 72 hours. The tattooed man in room 2319, the stranger she'd been confessing to for 3 weeks, would be gone by Sunday breakfast. She didn't know why it hit her like a fist to the sternum, why sudden tears burned hot behind her eyes. He was nobody to her. A dying criminal? A man whose very existence was built on violence and fear? Patricia had said his name like it was supposed to mean something terrible. But all Elena knew was the Virgin Mary on his neck, the rosary tattoo winding around his forearm, the way his face looked almost peaceful in the dim light when she talked to him, like maybe somewhere in the dark he was listening, like maybe he wasn't completely alone. She finished her rounds in a fog, mechanically wiping down surfaces and restocking supplies, but her mind kept circling back to room 2319. When she pushed her cart through the door at 11:15, she stood at the foot of his bed longer than usual, studying Jeffrey Fernandez's face. Strong jawline, dark stubble the nurses shaved every few days, a scar through his left eyebrow that made him look perpetually skeptical even in a coma. "They're giving up on you, señor," she whispered in Spanish, her voice catching. "Sunday morning. Your brother signed the papers." She moved closer, gripping the bed rail. "I don't know why I care. You're probably a monster. Patricia talks about you like you are, but you don't look like a monster to me.
You just look like someone who's lost." Elena pulled her rosary from her pocket, her abuela's rosary, worn smooth from decades of desperate prayers, and wrapped it once around Jeffrey's scarred hand, letting the wooden beads rest against his knuckles. "I'm going to pray for you every night until Sunday. I don't know if it matters. I don't know if God even listens to prayers for men like you, but my abuela said every soul deserves someone to stand at the door with them, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones." She squeezed his hand once, feeling the coolness of his skin, the absolute stillness. "Don't die alone, señor. Por favor, just hold on a little longer."
Christina's fever spiked at 9 p.m. on Saturday night, the night before they were going to let Jeffrey Fernandez die. Elena felt the heat radiating off her daughter's small body before she even touched her forehead, and when she did, the burning skin made her stomach drop. 104 degrees on the thermometer that barely worked. Christina was crying, a weak, pitiful sound that twisted something primal in Elena's chest. She called her neighbor Rosa, who sometimes watched Christina. No answer. She called the woman from church. Phone disconnected. Elena stared at her phone with shaking hands, calculating impossible math. The ER would cost thousands she didn't have. Calling out sick would get her fired, and she was already 3 days away from eviction. Christina whimpered in her arms, her little face flushed and damp with sweat. Elena made a decision that terrified her. She wrapped Christina in her work jacket, the child's feverish body tucked against her chest, and took 2 buses to Jackson Memorial. The guard at the employee entrance barely glanced at her. He never did. Invisible Elena, the ghost who cleaned the floors. She made it to the supply closet on the ICU floor and gave Christina children's Tylenol she'd stolen from the pharmacy cart, hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the syringe. Christina swallowed it with a whimper, then curled into Elena's neck, her skin scorching through the thin fabric of Elena's scrubs. For 2 hours, Elena tried to work with Christina clinging to her, the toddler's weight making her back scream as she mopped floors and emptied bins. By midnight, Christina was delirious, crying softly, her little hands gripping Elena's shirt with desperate strength. Elena's own exhaustion was a physical thing, dragging at her bones, blurring her vision. When she pushed her cart into room 2319, she was on the edge of collapse. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Jeffrey Fernandez lay still and silent, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Tomorrow morning, this room would be empty. Tomorrow morning, he'd be gone. Elena looked at the broad expanse of his chest, at the hospital gown rising and falling, and something desperate and impossible occurred to her. Just 10 minutes. She needed to clean this room, needed to finish her shift, and Christina was burning up and crying, and there was nowhere else to put her down. "Perdóname," Elena whispered, and with trembling hands she lifted Christina, feverish and limp in her little red dress, and laid her carefully on Jeffrey Fernandez's chest. The toddler's small body rose and fell with his mechanical breathing. Her tiny hands instinctively clutched at his hospital gown. Her hot cheek pressed against the tattoos over his heart. Elena stepped back, grabbed her mop, and started cleaning with tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter sleep on the chest of a dying criminal because she had nowhere else in the world to go.
Jeffrey Fernandez had been drowning in gray nothing for so long he'd forgotten what sensation felt like. No light, no sound, no body, just endless fog and the distant echo of a woman's voice telling him stories about stars and yellow shoes and a little girl who laughed like wind chimes. That voice was the only tether keeping him from dissolving completely into the void. Then something changed. Weight, warmth, The sensation crashed into his consciousness like a tsunami into empty shore. Something small and burning hot pressed against his chest, rising and falling with breaths that weren't his own. Tiny hands clutching fabric, the scent of baby shampoo and fever sweat, and something pure that didn't belong in the darkness where he'd been trapped. Sound filtered in next, not the woman's voice this time, but smaller, softer, a child's labored breathing, congested and struggling. The beep of machines that had been background noise in his coma suddenly sharpened into clarity. And underneath it all, a heartbeat against his chest that wasn't his, rapid and bird-fragile and desperately alive. Jeffrey's consciousness clawed toward that heartbeat like a drowning man toward the surface. His fingers moved first, just a twitch, then a conscious flex. His right hand, the one with Mort tattooed across the knuckles, shifted on the hospital bed and found something small and warm, a child's back, delicate ribs expanding with each breath. He could feel the fever radiating through the thin fabric of a dress. His eyes opened. The fluorescent lights stabbed into his vision, brutal and white and real. Jeffrey blinked, his throat raw around the ventilator tube, his body screaming with atrophy and pain and the visceral shock of consciousness returning to flesh that had been abandoned for a month. But none of that mattered, because there was a little girl on his chest, blonde hair in a messy bun, red dress, skin flushed with fever, and every protective instinct he'd buried under years of violence roared to life. His hand curled over her back, holding her to him. The machines erupted, alarms screaming, monitors flashing, the ventilator detecting spontaneous breathing and triggering emergency protocols. Jeffrey's other hand moved, wrapping around the child, even as footsteps thundered into the room. "Oh my God!" Patricia's voice, shocked and disbelieving. "He's awake! Dr. Ramos, 2319. Patient is responsive." Hands reached to the little girl, tried to lift her away. Jeffrey's grip tightened instinctively, his scarred fingers splaying across her small back in a gesture that was pure protection. His eyes, gray and sharp and fully conscious, locked onto Patricia with an intensity that made the nurse freeze. "Don't." The word came out as a rasp around the ventilator tube, barely human, but absolutely clear. "Mine." More doctors flooded in. Someone was calling for Mateo, Marco's voice outside, demanding to know what was happening. But Jeffrey didn't look away from the child on his chest, didn't loosen his hold, even as medical staff swarmed around him, trying to understand what science couldn't explain. Across the room, Elena stood frozen with a mop in her hands, watching the impossible unfold, her daughter cradled against the chest of a man who'd just clawed his way back from death to protect her.
Jeffrey Fernandez was sitting upright within 48 hours, a medical impossibility that had Dr. Ramos running every scan and test available while muttering about spontaneous neural regeneration that didn't exist in any literature. The ventilator came out. The feeding tube came out. Jeffrey's vitals stabilized like someone had flipped a switch from dying to living without bothering with the slow recovery in between. Marco stood guard inside the room now instead of outside, watching his boss with something between relief and superstitious fear. "You should be dead," he said on the third day, handing Jeffrey water with a straw. "Your organs were failing. Your brain was—" "I know what my brain was," Jeffrey cut him off, his voice still rough but gaining strength. "Tell me about the cleaning woman, the one with the little girl." Marco blinked. "Elena Lopez. She's been cleaning your room since you got here. Talks to you every night in Spanish." He paused. "Why?" "Because her daughter saved my life." Jeffrey took the water, his hand steady despite a month of atrophy. "And I want to know everything about her. Everything. Get Victor on it." Victor Reyes was Jeffrey's investigator, a former FBI analyst who'd gone private and specialized in finding things people didn't want found.
Within 24 hours, a manila folder landed on Jeffrey's hospital tray, thick with documentation that read like a chronicle of survival against impossible odds. Jeffrey read it twice. Elena Gabriela Lopez, 29 years old, undocumented, entered the U.S. 4 years ago through human trafficking routes. Husband Carlos Lopez, killed in gang crossfire in Alpacino, wrong place, wrong time, bullet through the throat. Daughter Cristina Maria Lopez, born premature at Jackson Memorial, 2 months in NICU. Current medical debt, $18,247. Employment, hospital custodian, $11 an hour, night shift. Secondary employment, weekend laundromat attendant. Residence, studio apartment, Little Havana, $840 a month, currently 12 days past due on rent. But it was the last section that made Jeffrey's jaw tighten. Miguel Santos, enforcer for the Delgado organization, had been making monthly visits to Elena's apartment for the past 18 months, claiming Carlos had owed money before his death. Witnesses reported Santos making explicit threats, sexual overtures, and on February 14th, touching the child's hair, while telling Elena it would be a shame if something happened to her mama. Jeffrey closed the folder carefully, his hands completely steady, despite the rage burning cold in his chest. This woman, this angel who'd sat with him every night, who told him stories about her daughter's laugh and yellow shoes and the moon through barred windows, was being hunted by a two-bit enforcer who thought he could terrorize someone because she was invisible and powerless. "Marco," Jeffrey said quietly, and his lieutenant knew that tone. It was the voice Jeffrey used before bodies started dropping. "I need you to find Miguel Santos. Don't touch him yet. Just find him and watch him. I want to know everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to, every breath he takes. Boss, and get Elena Lopez's landlord on the phone. Her rent is paid, retroactively, all of it."
Elena was folding laundry in the hospital break room when the TV mounted in the corner cut to breaking news. Miracle recovery at Jackson Memorial. Comatose crime boss awakens after month-long coma. The anchor's face was professionally neutral, but Elena could hear the skepticism underneath. Jeffrey Fernandez, alleged head of Miami's most powerful criminal organization, has made what doctors are calling an unprecedented recovery after being declared neurologically unresponsive for 4 weeks. The screen cut to file footage. Jeffrey Fernandez being let out of a federal courthouse in handcuffs 2 years ago, his face harder and younger, but unmistakable. The tattoos were the same. The Virgin Mary on his neck, the rosary winding down his forearm, the scar through his eyebrow, the gray eyes that looked like they could calculate your death before you finished speaking. Elena's hands went numb. The shirt she'd been folding dropped to the floor. Connections to multiple homicides, racketeering, and drug trafficking operations throughout South Florida. Federal agents have declined to comment on whether charges will be filed pending his full recovery. The man she'd been confessing to for 3 weeks, the stranger she'd prayed over, wrapped her abuela's rosary around, trusted with her daughter's sleeping body. Jeffrey Fernandez, monster, killer, the most dangerous man in Miami. Cristina had slept on his chest. Cristina's little hands had clutched his hospital gown while Elena combed floors and whispered prayers. And he'd held her, protected her, refused to let the nurses take her, even as he was waking from a coma. Elena's stomach lurched. She barely made it to the bathroom before she threw up. 3 days later, she found him in the hospital's rehabilitation garden, sitting in a wheelchair, even though the nurses said he'd walked 30 feet that morning. Physical therapy was happening fast, too fast, like his body was remembering strength it shouldn't have anymore. He was alone except for the guard who stood 20 feet away, giving him space, but staying vigilant. Elena held Cristina's hand so tight the little girl whimpered, "Mommy, too hard."
Jeffrey looked up when he heard Christina's voice. His face changed, something softening in those calculating eyes, and Elena felt her terror spike because she recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd had when he woke up with Christina on his chest and refused to let go. Elena. His voice was rough but certain, like he'd been expecting her. She walked closer, her legs shaking, pulling Christina behind her. I saw the news. I know who you are now. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, edged with betrayal and fear. Jeffrey Fernandez, the Fernandez family. They say you've killed people. They say you're... Everything they say is true. He cut her off. No apology, no deflection, just cold fact. Every word. Christina peeked around Elena's legs, and Jeffrey's expression gentled impossibly. The little girl smiled, recognizing him. Mr. Jeff! Elena pulled her daughter back, and Jeffrey saw it. The fear, the way Elena positioned herself between him and Christina, like he was a threat she needed to defend against. Something flickered across his face, not anger, something closer to understanding. I would never hurt her, or you. Why should I believe you? You're a killer, a criminal. I let my daughter sleep on your chest, and you're... The man she brought back from the dead. Jeffrey's eyes held hers. And I owe her a debt I can never repay.
Jeffrey didn't apologize. Elena understood that on some fundamental level. Men like him didn't apologize for what they were, only for what they'd failed to do. Instead, he looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much death and said, I can't change what I am, but I can give you what you need. Safety, real safety, not promises, not charity, a debt paid. Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away from this tattooed devil who'd clawed back from death because her daughter's heartbeat had somehow anchored him to life. But she thought about Miguel Santos touching Christina's hair, about the eviction notice taped to her door, about the ICE checkpoint she detoured around twice last week, about being invisible and powerless and one mistake away from losing everything. I don't want your money, she said, but her voice wavered. It's not about want. Jeffrey leaned forward in the wheelchair, his intensity focused entirely on her. Your daughter gave me something nobody else could. She pulled me out of the dark when I'd already let go. That's not a debt I can walk away from, Elena. So let me do what I'm good at. Let me make your problems disappear. Miguel Santos disappeared first. Not dead, Jeffrey had Marco make that clear, just relocated to a Delgado organization warehouse in Caracas with a very pointed message about respecting boundaries. The medical debt vanished next, paid in full by an anonymous donor that the hospital billing department didn't question too closely. Elena's landlord called personally to apologize for the accounting error and inform her that her rent had been prepaid for the year. The immigration papers appeared in her mailbox on a Tuesday. Work authorization, pathway to permanent residency, Christina's birth certificate with proper documentation. All legal, all real, all impossible without someone powerful pulling strings that shouldn't be pulled. Elena cried in her tiny apartment, holding the papers with shaking hands, understanding what Jeffrey had done and terrified of what it meant. He came to her apartment 3 weeks after his discharge from the hospital, still moving carefully, but no longer using the cane. Christina saw him through the window and squealed, "Mr. Jeff!" before Elena could stop her. The door opened, and the most dangerous man in Miami stood in her doorway, holding a stuffed yellow rabbit from FAO Schwartz that cost more than Elena made in a month. "For Christina," he said simply. Elena let him in because what else could she do? He'd already saved her, already owned the debt between them.
And when Christina fell asleep in Jeffrey's arms an hour later, curled against his chest like she had that impossible night in room 2319, Elena watched this killer hold her daughter with a tenderness that didn't match the tattoos or the scars or the reputation. She watched him press his scarred knuckles gently against Christina's forehead, checking for fever like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "This is what you brought me back for," Jeffrey said quietly, not looking away from the sleeping child. "Not the empire, not revenge. This, her." And Elena understood then that resurrection wasn't about second chances. It was about finding the one thing worth protecting in a world built on violence. Jeffrey Fernandez had been brought back from darkness not by medicine or miracles, but by a 3-year-old girl in a red dress who refused to let the devil die alone. Now he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to be afraid again.
Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. It keeps these Mafia legends alive. Like, comment, and I'll see you in the next upload.